Unthinkable crimes, brutality, blood, and insanity. But when you look into the whereabouts, you get one name: the Backpack Killer. This documentary covers some of the most spine-shaking crimes committed by the worst Australian serial killer, Ivan Milat, 1989 to 1993. It was a time when Australian air was filled with terror, with people going missing and found dead. Something was seriously wrong. It was like someone was targeting people wearing backpacks. Newspapers were filled with headlines saying, "Backpack Murders." The chilling story begins when bodies start to surface in the Belanglo State Forest. Each victim, a backpacker from far-off lands, was cruelly murdered, leaving a trail of unspeakable horror behind. The gruesome discoveries sent shockwaves through the country, forcing the public to ask, why were these innocent lives taken? This cunning predator ruthlessly targeted his victims, luring them into a web of deceit and darkness. He saw them as mere pawns in his sick game, ultimately extinguishing their lives in an act of unspeakable brutality. Ivan Milat targeted backpackers because they were often young, vulnerable travelers far from home. These individuals, in search of adventure and new experiences, were more likely to accept rides or offers of help from strangers. This made them easier targets for Milat, who preyed upon their trust and goodwill. And this is how one of the murder stories began. On a Thursday afternoon, Paul Onions strode along the Hume Highway south of Sydney. Eager for adventure, he had journeyed to Australia and found himself seeking work as the days turned into weeks. Paul had traveled extensively, often hitchhiking without a care for his own safety. Trusting in the goodness of others, he thought nothing of hitching rides to explore the vast landscape. But it was this very trust that would soon place him in grave danger. As Paul walked along the highway, thumb outstretched in hopes of catching a ride, he could not have known that a chilling encounter awaited him. Unbeknownst to him, fate would lead him to cross paths with a cold-blooded killer, bringing him face to face with the very embodiment of death itself. The suspenseful journey was about to take a sinister turn as Paul's life hung in the balance, teetering on the edge of a precipice from which there was no return. As Paul heaved his backpack and finally approached the door, a silver truck pulled up beside him. A masculine man with a distinctive mustache stepped out, offering Paul a ride. Grateful, Paul accepted, and the stranger introduced himself as Bill. Bill's behavior grew increasingly agitated as they drove, making Paul uneasy. Bill's questions became personal and alarming, asking if anyone knew Paul's whereabouts or if he had special forces training. Imagine what a bluff it would have been if Onions said yes. Soon Bill pulled over, claiming to search for a cassette under the seat. Suspicious, Paul stepped out to gauge Bill's reaction. After claiming to stretch his legs, Paul returned to the truck to appease Bill. Moments later, Bill pulled over again, this time retrieving a length of rope. Panic set in as Paul realized Bill's dark intentions. As Paul struggled to unbuckle his seatbelt and escape, Bill aimed a revolver at him, threatening to shoot. Seizing the opportunity, Paul ran, dodging bullets and pleading for help from passing cars. Joanne Berry, a female bypasser with her family in the back seat, finally stopped to help. Fearing for their safety, she sped away from the scene. Paul had narrowly escaped a horrifying fate. He reported the incident to the police, but the report would remain buried for years. Stripped of his possessions, Paul returned to Sydney and left Australia, unaware of the true extent of the danger he had faced, until the truth about Bill emerged years later. But by no means the brutality was over in that era. Fast forward to September 19th, 1992. On a normal day in the large Belanglo State Forest, two runners taking part in an adventure event wandered into a creepy area called Executioner's Drop. As they went deeper, a strange smell of decay filled the air. Thinking they would find a dead animal, they slowed down, but instead, they came across a scary sight. Two women lay face down in a shallow grave, their hands tied behind them, hidden under plants and leaves. They were too decomposed to recognize. Detectives found signs of the killer's presence at the frightening scene: a simple fireplace, cigarette butts, and used .22 caliber shells. The horrible acts of the criminal were only beginning to show. The victims were identified as Caroline Clark, 21, and Joanne Walters, 22, both from Britain, who had traveled to Sydney looking for nanny jobs. Their terrible murders revealed a shocking picture of torture and cruelty. Walters had been gagged and stabbed many times, one wound so deep it cut part of her spine. Clark had multiple stab wounds and at least 10 gunshot wounds to the head, suggesting she had been used for target practice. Even though they searched the area for more clues or victims, the police found nothing that would give them a strong lead. Stories of a serial killer hiding in Belanglo State Forest spread, but the authorities were not convinced. Forensic evidence led investigators to ask Dr. Rod Milton, a forensic psychiatrist, for help. After looking at the crime scene and evidence, Dr. Milton came up with a profile of the killer, a man in his mid-30s with a history of anger, familiar with the area and driven by cruel desires. Despite the profile, the case moved slowly. Leads went cold, and the investigation began to fade away, leaving the identity of the heartless murderer a puzzling mystery. It just took 13 months to ignite a new fire in the jungle. Two 19-year-olds, James Gibson and Deborah Everest, were found dead, both of them missing since 1989 when they were on their way to a conservation festival. When their wounds were matched to the women found earlier, there were quite some similarities. They were also stabbed in a similar manner, and this brought a seemingly dead case back to the investigations again. The New South Wales Police Department assigned Superintendent Clive Small, the Assistant Police Commissioner, to handle the case. Small had experience with difficult cases, but this was perhaps the cruelest he had ever seen. He took charge of the investigation and believed that identifying all the victims was crucial to catching the killer. He set up a large task force to search the extended area of Belanglo Forest, hoping to find more bodies. Almost a month after finding the teenagers, the police discovered the body of Simone Schmidl, a German backpacker. She had been brutally attacked and had the same puncture to the spine as the other victims. The crime scene had the same hallmarks: a crude fireplace, shell casings, and a shallow grave covered in debris. 3 days after finding Simone, the police found 2 more victims, as if there was not stopping this brutality. Anya Habshid and her boyfriend Gabor Neugebauer were strangled and shot, while Anya had multiple stab wounds and was gruesomely decapitated with a machete. It's so insanely difficult to even talk about that her head was never found. Small realized that no one was safe as long as the killer was free. He confirmed to the public that a serial killer was among them and published photographs of the victims. The killer targeted young men and women seeking work and adventure, but what they received was horrifying. At this time, Small was living in a pressure cooker. Citizen plead and sometimes even threatened him to get the job done as they lived in the air of insanity with a killer out in the open. And then his luck decided to have mercy on him. 1994, Paul Onions appears again. But this time not with his visa or passport, but on a phone call. He called the police after checking the news. Make one thing clear at this point, that Ivan Milat was already on the radars of the police. Anyways, Paul called and told his whole story to the officer. Small then spoke to Joanne Barry to find all the missing links. Paul was called back to Australia and was shown a photo lineup. Without any doubt or hesitation, Onions identified Milat as his attacker. Now it was the time to get search warrants to enter his property. Small managed everything silently and professionally without leaving any clues. Around 50 police officers took surround of Ivan's house, and they were all wearing bulletproof vests. While Ivan thought his friends were pranking him, he was arrested by the police. Evidence of his heinous crimes was spread through his room and other parts of his property. Guns, cigarettes, ammunition, and the eeriest one of them all, Joanne Walters' skull. Everything was found. On another day, during a search at Milat's mother's house, police found a curved machete locked in a glass case. Small brought Milat in for questioning, but being familiar with interrogations, he remained silent. While evidence mounted against him, Milat was held on assault charges until ballistics confirmed a positive identification. John Marsden, his defense attorney, also came to believe that Milat was guilty. March 1996, after 2 years of delay, a trial date was finally set. Milat did talk up, trying to prove his innocence, but every odd was against him, and for good. 15 weeks later, the jury declared him guilty and was sentenced 7 life sentences, along with 6 years of prison. Ivan Milat, desperate to escape the confines of his prison cell, devised an elaborate plan to break free. He spent days observing the guards' routines, searching for any weaknesses to exploit. Milat gradually gathered materials he could use to craft makeshift tools, hiding them from the watchful eyes of the prison staff. He also partnered up with a fellow inmate who was later found dead in a cell. His plan ultimately failed. His security was tightened, and his privileges were stripped away because of his actions. But the story doesn't end here. A woman named Challenger Hughes came forward claiming that her ex-husband, not Ivan Milat, was the real backpacker murderer. She alleged that her ex-husband had a violent history and could have committed the crimes. However, her claims were ultimately dismissed as the evidence against Ivan was overwhelming and conclusive. She did try to help him out of prison, but more than 400 pieces of evidence were directly against him. The whole story of this woman did nothing but make the case of Milat doubtful. Subscribe to the channel if this story blew you away. In 2019, Milat was diagnosed with terminal esophageal and stomach cancer. His health deteriorated rapidly despite being treated at the Prince of Wales Hospital in Sydney. Ivan Milat died on October 27, 2019, at the age of 74, in the Long Bay Correctional Center Hospital. The bottom line is that he met his fate in a natural way. These video links popping on your screen will take you on a journey of untold crime stories that will shake you to the core. Until next time, goodbye.